When Tarantino talks movies, he's never shy about ripping into stuff he hates, and he's been super clear about the 80s. He thinks the decade is the worst. After the wild creativity of the 70s, Hollywood basically chickened out and went safe. Tarantino said it straight up. We were after a real chancy cinema with balls, and this was a ballless decade. But even Tarantino admits that sometimes, rare as it was, something genuinely awesome would pop up. In his own words, every once in a while a movie would pierce through, and it would be like, oh wow, that was terrific. So here are the only 6 movies from the 80s Tarantino actually loves and says you need to watch. Tarantino's biggest beef with the 80s was pretty clear. Hollywood wanted everything safe, nice, and likable. Every character had to be someone you liked. Every story had to be comfortable. Likeable was basically the rule. Year of the Dragon completely ignored that rule. Nobody's nice here. Michael Cimino, somehow still working after Heaven's Gate completely bombed, convinced another studio to hand him $24 million in final cut. And he delivered something even crazier. A brutal, over-the-top cop thriller where Mickey Rourke rampages through Chinatown like some kind of angry racist Dirty Harry on steroids. It bombed horribly. Critics ripped it apart, calling it xenophobic. Chinese-American groups protested the film's release. Cimino himself claimed all that controversy would help sell tickets. It absolutely did not. The film tanked, and hard. But Tarantino loves it. It's stylish, violent, insane, and has one of his all-time favorite movie moments, the final shootout on the train tracks. He calls it one of those scenes where you literally forget to breathe. And he insists that despite all its controversy and madness, it's absolutely one of the greatest films of the 80s. Look, there's no way around it. This film was a disaster. On paper, it looked perfect. You had director Hal Ashby, legendary for classics like Harold and Maude. You had Jeff Bridges and a young Andy Garcia. Script by Oliver Stone, adapted from a celebrated detective novel by Lawrence Block. How could it fail? Well, it failed spectacularly. Ashby got fired right after principal photography. The studio took control. The script got rewritten constantly. Oliver Stone was furious, said the finished film barely resembled what he'd originally written. Actress Alexandra Paul later said she barely recognized the movie she'd filmed because they kept changing the script literally every day. But Tarantino genuinely loves this mess. To him, it's a lost gem of gritty, dark 80s noir. He's even said the warehouse action scene at the end is one of his favorite action sequences ever. Tarantino describes it as another scene where you literally forget your breathing because you get so sucked into the action. Everyone knows The Silence of the Lambs, but years before Anthony Hopkins became Hannibal Lecter, director Michael Mann made Manhunter, the first adaptation of Thomas Harris's novel Red Dragon. This one starred Brian Cox as Lecter, and while it completely flopped in theaters, Tarantino actually prefers it to the later Hopkins version. Originally, weirdly enough, David Lynch was going to direct it, but he backed out because he found the material too violent and disturbing. Lynch said he got sick of it, calling the material too degenerate even for him. So Mann took over, fresh off his gritty crime classic Thief, which Tarantino absolutely loves. He's always praised Mann for his incredible visuals, authentic dialogue, and stylish storytelling. When Thief came out, Tarantino said it blew everyone's mind. Manhunter didn't succeed financially, got overshadowed fast by the success of Jonathan Demme's Silence of the Lambs. But Tarantino insists this is actually the better film. Speaking of Michael Mann, he was originally supposed to write this one, actually started on the screenplay but left to go direct The Keep. Instead, Jim McBride took over and made a completely different kind of remake of Jean-Luc Godard's famous 1960 French film. Tarantino absolutely loves this remake. He's called it the coolest movie ever made. In his words, here's a movie that indulges completely all my obsessions. Comic books, rockabilly music, and movies. The movie stars Richard Gere, back when he was still considered a serious sex symbol, as Jesse, this reckless guy who steals a car, shoots a cop, and meets a confused 19-year-old girl. From there, he gets involved trying to collect an old debt, but mostly he's just getting deeper and deeper into trouble. When this came out, critics absolutely hated it. Roger Ebert famously called it a lurid melodrama about sex and death and said it was all style. no substance, though he admitted it was still good-looking and strangely entertaining. Despite that savage reaction from critics, the movie actually made money, grossed about $20 million off a $7 million budget. Years later, Tarantino said on Joe Rogan's show, "This was the only movie back then that felt like the kind of movies I would later make myself." McBride's remake of Breathless was about as close to a Quentin movie as I'd ever seen in theaters. Now here's a pretty underrated movie from the legendary Paul Verhoeven. You know him from stuff like RoboCop and Total Recall. This film is set in medieval Italy. Gunpowder's just started changing warfare, and engineers of the Renaissance are being forced to invent new weapons. And it's not your typical romantic medieval story. Verhoeven wanted to show how brutal and disgusting life actually was back then. Violence, poverty, disease everywhere. It's about a group of mercenaries who basically become highway robbers, getting caught up in all sorts of violent adventures. Tarantino specifically praised Rutger Hauer's performance here. He called it fantastic and said it's one of his favorite 80s movies. Behind the scenes, though, things got pretty tense. Verhoeven and Hauer had worked together multiple times before in Europe, but this film basically killed their relationship. They never worked together again after this. And because of its heavy nudity and graphic violence, the movie got seriously cut down in the US release. Didn't help the film's box office either, even though Verhoeven himself would soon explode in Hollywood. Everyone knows The Lost Boys as the vampire movie from the 80s, right? But Tarantino prefers another vampire flick from that same year, one that kind of got buried by the huge success of The Lost Boys and some studio mess: Catherine Bigelow's Near Dark. This was Bigelow's first solo directing job, a kind of horror western hybrid about a bunch of nomadic vampires traveling around the Midwest, causing chaos. Tarantino is basically this film's #1 fan. On Bret Easton Ellis's podcast, he straight up said, "I'm the hugest fan of Near Dark," and explained how he'd followed Bigelow's whole career closely because of it. The scene Tarantino loves most, the scene he literally watched the movie multiple times just to re-experience, is the massacre in the bar. On Joe Rogan, he specifically said, "No scene in the movie topped that massacre scene, but that didn't matter. That scene alone was so good, I went to see the movie 5 times." Initially, Bigelow wanted to make a classic Western, but nobody was making those in the 80s. Zero interest. So she and the writer decided to mix Western themes with horror, which was big at the time. Bigelow was still totally untested as a solo director, and producer Edward S. Feldman straight up told her, "If you're not handling this after 5 days, you're gone." Obviously, she handled it fine. She kept the job and made a cult classic. But studio trouble hit anyway. The studio that made it literally went bankrupt right after finishing it. So the movie got almost no marketing, got completely buried when it opened, and bombed at the box office. Completely unfair considering how much Tarantino and honestly a lot of other people now love this film.